The first thing that hit him was the smell. It was the smell of a funeral pyre, charred pine, burnt earth, and something else, the death of a dream. Ezekiel Morrison pulled his wagon to a stop, the dust settling around the hooves of his tired horses. He pulled his hat low, but it did nothing to block the sight before him. Where a sturdy log cabin should have stood, there were only black skeletal timbers clawing at the Wyoming sky. The homestead of Prudence Whitmore, the woman he'd come 1,000 miles to marry, was nothing but a pile of ash and sorrow. In his pocket, he could feel the crisp edges of her letters. They spoke of a good life, of fertile land, of a widow's hope for a helping hand. They spoke of a future. But the wind whipping across the valley floor seemed to laugh at those words, carrying the ghost of a life that was no more. Ezekiel was 42 years old. He'd buried a wife, built a fortune, and walked away from it all looking for something real. He thought he'd found it in those letters. Now, staring at the ruin, he wondered if he'd just found another kind of grave. He climbed down from the wagon, his boots crunching on the debris. The barn was still standing, just barely, its roof torn open like a wound. He walked toward it, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. This was wild country, and a disaster like this could attract predators of every kind. And that's when he saw her. She was sitting on a charred stump near the barn, her back ramrod straight. She wore a simple soot-stained dress, and her dark hair was pulled back in a tight, severe bun. She wasn't weeping. She was watching the smoldering remains of her life with a look of fierce, unyielding defiance. But it was her left arm that stole the air from Ezekiel's lungs, or rather, the empty space where her arm should have been. The sleeve of her dress was pinned neatly, surgically, at the shoulder. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sea, and they held no hint of surrender. "You must be Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice steady, betraying nothing. "I apologize for the state of things." Ezekiel took off his hat. He'd faced down armed bandits and crooked businessmen, but the quiet dignity of this broken woman struck him dumb. "Ma'am," he managed. "What happened here?" "Lightning," she said, a little too quickly. 3 nights ago, a bad storm." He looked at the clear blue sky, then back at the ruins. Something felt wrong. The burn pattern was too even, too complete, and the smell. There was a faint, chemical tang beneath the wood smoke that didn't belong. He decided not to press. Not yet. "You've been out here alone since?" "In the barn," she said, gesturing with her one hand. "Mr. Morrison, I release you from our agreement. This is not the arrangement you were promised. You are free to go." He took a step closer, his eyes scanning the ashes. And then he saw it. Half buried near the foundation of the house was a small, dark object. It was the stub of a cigar, a thick, expensive-looking one with a gold band. It was the kind of thing a wealthy man from the city might smoke, not a homesteader, and certainly not a widow struggling to survive. He subtly kicked some ash over it with the toe of his boot, hiding it from her view. This was no lightning strike. This was an arson, and Prudence Whitmore was lying to him. "I'm not going anywhere, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice low and firm. He looked from the hidden cigar butt to her face, a new question burning in his mind. What else was she hiding? A promise is a promise. We're going to rebuild. Her composure finally cracked. For a second, a flicker of raw, desperate hope lit up her green eyes before being immediately extinguished by a wave of fear. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling for the first time. "You can't stay. It's not safe here." Before he could ask what she meant, a tiny voice called out from the damaged barn. "Mama?" A little girl, no older than 10, stepped out into the sunlight. She had the same dark hair and piercing green eyes as her mother. She clutched a small, hand-carved wooden doll and stared at Ezekiel with an unnerving intensity. This is my daughter, Beatrice, Prudence said, her voice regaining its strength. There's something else you should know, Prudence said later that night, as they shared a meager meal of jerky and hardtack by a small fire. Beatrice was asleep in the barn, wrapped in every blanket they owned. My late husband, Samuel, he wasn't a popular man. He made enemies. Ezekiel watched her carefully. What kind of enemies? He was a dreamer, she said, staring into the flames. Always chasing the next big score. He borrowed money from the wrong people. She wouldn't meet his eyes. When he died, the debts didn't die with him. So that was it. A local strongman was squeezing her for her husband's debts, burned her out to scare her off the land. It was a story as old as the frontier. We'll deal with them, Ezekiel said. You don't know who you're dealing with, she insisted. Silas Croft owns this valley. He owns the sheriff, the bank, everything. He wants this land for the water rights, the fire. It was a message. Ezekiel thought of the $15,000 hidden in the false bottom of his wagon chest. It was a fortune that could buy an army of lawyers or an army of guns. He'd brought it to build a life, but maybe he was meant to use it to fight a war. I'm not a man who scares easily, Prudence, he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out his heavy leather checkbook. Tomorrow we ride into town. We're going to buy supplies. We're going to buy so much lumber and hardware this Silas Croft will know we're not just rebuilding. We're building a fortress. He expected to see relief on her face. Instead, he saw sheer terror. No! She gasped, her eyes wide. You can't show that you have money. That's the worst thing you could do. It's what he wants. He'll see you as a prize, not a threat. He'll take everything from you, just like he's trying to take everything from me. Ezekiel stared at her, the checkbook feeling suddenly heavy in his hand. He had come here thinking his wealth was his greatest weapon. But in this twisted, isolated valley, it might just be the bait that would get them both killed. He had walked away from one life of cutthroat business, only to land in a place where the stakes were infinitely higher. And the woman he had promised to protect was more afraid of his help than she was of the man who burned down her home. The town of Cheyenne was a viper's nest disguised as progress. Saloons and storefronts were being thrown up with hurried ambition, but underneath it all, Ezekiel felt a current of fear. People averted their eyes when they saw Prudence. Whispers followed them like shadows. At the mercantile, Ezekiel began placing his order. Not with his checkbook, but with a small roll of cash he kept for show. Lumber, nails, window glass, a new cast-iron stove. The proprietor, a nervous man named Henderson, kept glancing toward the door. That's a big order, Morrison, Henderson stammered, wiping his sweaty palms on his apron. Building before winter? Bold. My wife and daughter need a roof over their heads, Ezekiel said, deliberately using the word wife. He saw Prudence flinch beside him. Of course, Henderson said, refusing to meet his eye. Just be careful. Silas Croft, he don't like competition. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He especially don't like folks who get too close to the Whitmore place. Says that land has bad luck. It was a clear, unmistakable threat, delivered by proxy. Their next stop was the sheriff's office. It was a small, dusty room that smelled of stale coffee and cheap cigars. Sheriff Bodine was a large, fleshy man with a tin star pinned crookedly to his vest. He listened to Ezekiel's report of the fire with a bored expression. Lightning, you say? Bodine grunted, leaning back in his chair so far it groaned in protest. That's the story, Ezekiel said, watching the sheriff's eyes. But I found this. He placed the cigar stub on the desk. The gold band glinted in the dusty light. Bodine glanced at it and shrugged. Means nothing. Drifter probably dropped it. A drifter smoking a $2 cigar? Ezekiel pressed. In this economy? The sheriff's eyes narrowed. A flicker of something cold and dangerous passed through them. You're new here, Morrison. You don't know how things work. Sometimes things happen. Storms, fires, accidents. A smart man learns to accept it and move on. You look like a smart man. The message was clear. The law was not on their side. The law belonged to Silas Croft. They left the office, the silence in the wagon heavier than any of the supplies they had yet to load. Prudence's fear was a tangible thing now, a third passenger sitting between them. Their last stop was at the edge of town, a neat little house belonging to the schoolteacher, Miss Hartwell, who had been caring for Beatrice. The girl was waiting on the porch. When she saw the wagon, she didn't run to her mother. She stood her ground, her small face a mask of suspicion, her knuckles white as she gripped her wooden doll. "Mama," she said, her voice small but firm. "Miss Hartwell says you brought a man." "This is Mr. Morrison, sweetheart," Prudence said, her voice strained. He's going to help us." Ezekiel knelt down to the girl's level. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Beatrice. Your mother has told me a lot about you." The girl didn't smile. Her green eyes, so like her mother's, scanned his face with an unnerving wisdom. She held up the doll. It was crudely carved, a little wooden figure of a man. "My papa made me this," she said, before he went away. "He was a talented man," Ezekiel said gently. Beatrice leaned in closer, so close that only he could hear her whisper. Her voice was a sliver of ice. "The smoking man made him go away. The smoking man made the fire." Ezekiel's blood ran cold. He glanced up at Prudence, who was watching them with a pained expression. She knew. She knew it all. The lightning story was a lie to protect her daughter. As they rode out of town, with a silent Beatrice squeezed between them, Ezekiel felt the full weight of his situation. He was trapped in a valley run by a tyrant, with a corrupt sheriff for law. He was trying to protect a woman who was terrified of his help, and a child who was haunted by a monster she called the Smoking Man. He looked back at the town, a knot of buildings shrinking in the distance. He had come to Wyoming seeking a simple life, but as the homestead, their future battlefield, came into view, he knew he had found the exact opposite. He was a rich man with no allies, a fiancé with no trust, and a protector with no one to watch his back, and the first nail had yet to be hammered. The work was a strange kind of therapy. As the walls of the new house went up, a fragile sense of hope began to take root. Ezekiel was a master carpenter, his hands sure and steady. Prudence, despite having only one arm, was a tireless partner. She learned to hold boards with her knees and feet, to pass him tools with uncanny anticipation, to manage the logistics of the site with a brilliant, practical mind. But the piece of the work was a thin veneer over a constant, gnawing tension. They were being watched. Tools would disappear from where they'd been left, only to reappear in the woods days later, rusted from the dew. At night, they would hear the snap of a twig just beyond the firelight, or the faint whinny of a horse where no horse should be. One morning, they awoke to find the fresh frame of a wall kicked in, the lumber splintered and broken. It was a campaign of psychological warfare, designed to break their spirit. It was Croft's way of saying, "This land is mine. You are building on borrowed time." Beatrice grew more withdrawn. She spent hours in the half-built house, whispering to her wooden doll. Ezekiel would find her staring out the empty frame of a window, watching the trail that led to town, her small body rigid with anxiety. The smoking man was no childish fantasy. He was a real and present danger in her mind. One afternoon, the danger stopped being a ghost in the trees and rode right into their yard. He came on a magnificent black stallion, a stark contrast to their own workhorses. He was a tall, handsome man in his 50s, dressed in an expensive tailored suit that seemed out of place on the rugged frontier. A thick, unlit cigar was clenched between his teeth. It was Silas Croft. "Morrison!" he boomed, his voice a rich baritone that dripped with false cordiality. He dismounted with an easy grace. "I heard a new fellow was setting up shop on the old Whitmore place. Had to come welcome you to the valley." Croft, Ezekiel said, his voice flat. He set down his hammer and stood between the man and the house, where he could hear Prudence quickly gathering Beatrice inside. Croft's eyes swept over the construction, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. Ambitious project. Most folks would have cut their losses after a tragedy like the fire. This land seems to have a curse on it. I don't believe in curses, Ezekiel said. No? You should, Croft replied, his voice losing its friendly edge. He took a step closer. This is hard country. It chews up and spits out men who don't know their place. It takes more than lumber and nails to survive here. It takes alliances. It was an offer and a threat, rolled into one. Join me or be destroyed. I'm just a simple man looking to build a home for my family, Ezekiel said, his hand inching closer to his revolver. Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. There's nothing simple about this, Morrison. You're on my land. He finally lit his cigar, the flame illuminating the cold cruelty in his eyes. It was the same brand, the same gold band. Prudence should have told you. Her husband, Samuel, he sold me the water rights to this entire parcel before he passed on. The land is useless without the water. You're building on a sandcastle. Ezekiel stared at him, stunned. He looked toward the house. Was this the secret Prudence was keeping? Was her husband's betrayal even deeper than she'd let on? I have the deed right here, Croft said, patting his breast pocket. Signed by Samuel Whitmore himself. Of course, I'd be willing to sell the land back to you. For a price. Consider it a neighborly gesture. The trap was brilliant in its cruelty. Croft didn't just want to scare them off. He had a legal claim, a stranglehold that made their entire effort pointless. He had let them sweat and toil and pour their hope into the earth, just so he could enjoy the moment he snatched it all away. And as Croft rode off, leaving a trail of smug blue smoke behind him, Ezekiel realized the terrible truth. Prudence hadn't just been afraid of Croft. She had been ashamed. Ashamed that the land she'd invited him to share, the future she'd offered, was built on a lie she was too terrified to confess. The foundation of their new home and their new life was a fraud. The confrontation was quiet, but it shattered the fragile peace they had built. That night, after a silent dinner, Ezekiel finally asked the question that hung between them like a shroud. Is it true, Prudence? Did Samuel sell the water rights to Croft? She stared at the rough-hewn table, her one hand twisting a loose thread on her apron. She couldn't look at him. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Yes, she whispered. Why didn't you tell me? His voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was hollow with the pain of betrayal. Because I was ashamed, she cried, finally looking up, her eyes blazing with a mix of defiance and despair. Because my husband was a weak, foolish man who gambled away our future. Because I hoped if we just built the house fast enough, if we made a life here, it would somehow make it real. I hoped the lie would become the truth. Then the whole story came tumbling out, a torrent of grief and humiliation she had held back for years. Samuel wasn't just a dreamer. He was a drunk, and he was abusive. The threshing accident that took her arm. It wasn't an accident. It happened during one of his drunken rages. He'd grabbed her, she'd pulled away, and she'd fallen into the machine. Ezekiel felt the blood drain from his face. The story he'd built in his mind of a heroic husband who died saving his wife was a lie, and it was about to get so much worse. He didn't die of an infection, Ezekiel, she said, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper. The final, terrible secret. He saw what he had done to me. He saw the ruin he had made of our lives. And the next morning, he was gone. He ran away. He abandoned me and Beatrice. Ezekiel stood frozen, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Every piece of this puzzle was darker than the last. He was building a home on stolen land for a woman whose husband wasn't a dead hero, but a living coward. "He's alive?" Ezekiel breathed. "I don't know," she sobbed, burying her face in her hand. "I haven't heard from him in 2 years. I assumed he was dead. I hoped he was dead." Beatrice, the smoking man, made her papa go away. It wasn't a metaphor. Croft hadn't killed Samuel. He had run him off. The fire, the threats. It was all to claim the land that Samuel had sold and then abandoned. Ezekiel's mind reeled. He had thought he was in a fight with a land baron, but he was caught in the middle of a toxic, tragic family drama, with secrets that had festered for years. He had given his promise to a woman who hadn't told him the first thing about the truth of her life. He walked to the doorway and stared out into the oppressive darkness of the Wyoming night. The wind howled, rattling the new window frames. It sounded like a woman weeping, or maybe a man screaming. He had come here to escape the complexities of his old life, but the life he had chosen was built on a foundation of lies, secrets, and ghosts. And the most terrifying ghost of all wasn't dead. He was out there somewhere, and a man who would abandon his wife and child was capable of anything. A week passed in a state of suspended animation. The work on the house slowed to a crawl. The air between Ezekiel and Prudence was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of Samuel's sins. Ezekiel felt adrift, his purpose clouded by deception. Was he building a home, or a monument to another man's failure? Then the letter came. It was delivered by a freight driver passing through. A dirty, crumpled envelope addressed in a spidery, barely legible scrawl to Mrs. Prudence Whitmore. Prudence stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. Her face went pale. "It's his handwriting," she breathed. With trembling fingers, she tore it open. Ezekiel watched as every last drop of color drained from her face. She held the letter out to him, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. He took the single sheet of paper. The words were a drunken scrawl, full of self-pity and menace. "My dearest Prudence, I hear you've found yourself a rich new man. Good for you. I'm sure he's enjoying the land I worked so hard for. I'm down on my luck in the mining camp at Eagle's Peak. It's a hard life. I find myself thinking of you, and of my daughter. I believe a man like your Mr. Morrison would pay a handsome sum for me to stay away, for me to forget that I am still your legal husband, and the legal father of Beatrice. $5,000 should be enough to help me forget. If I don't hear from you in 1 week, I will assume you wish for a family reunion. I will come home. Your loving husband, Samuel." Ezekiel read it once. Then he read it again. The final trap had been sprung. This wasn't about land anymore. It wasn't about water rights or a local tyrant. This was about ownership. Samuel Whitmore was reasserting his claim, not just to the property, but to Prudence and Beatrice themselves. The law, as crooked as it was, would be on his side. Prudence was still his wife. He could walk back in and take everything, and Ezekiel would be nothing more than a wealthy boarder. Croft's plan was diabolical. He hadn't just run Samuel off. He had kept him on a leash, a secret weapon to be deployed at the perfect moment. "Pay me for the land, or I bring back the husband who maimed you and will legally take your child." It was checkmate. "What are we going to do?" Prudence whispered, her voice a fragile thread. Ezekiel looked at her, at the raw terror in her eyes. He looked toward the room where Beatrice was playing, oblivious to the monster scratching at the door. In that moment, all the betrayal and all the lies washed away, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He was no longer just a carpenter or a mail-order husband. He was a protector. This was his family now. The promise he made to a stranger in a letter had been forged into something real by shared hardship and common enemies. "Eagle's Peak is a 2-day ride from here," Ezekiel said, his voice deadly calm. He walked over to the wooden chest that held his fortune, but he didn't open it. He reached for the oiled leather gun belt hanging beside it. You're not going to pay him? Prudence asked, her eyes wide. Ezekiel strapped the belt around his waist and checked the action on his Colt. The metallic click echoed in the silent room. Some debts aren't meant to be paid in cash, Prudence, he said, his voice like flint. I'm not going to give that man a single dollar. I'm going to have a conversation with your husband. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the man he had been before he came to Wyoming. Not a gentle farmer, but a man who had clawed his way to the top in a world of sharks and cutthroats. A man who knew that some negotiations could only end one way. You're going to kill him, she breathed, a horrified understanding dawning on her face. Ezekiel didn't answer. He just pulled his hat down low, walked out the door, and rode west, toward a confrontation that would either free them forever or damn them all. The mining camp at Eagle's Peak was a circle of hell Dante had forgotten to mention. It was a chaotic mess of muddy streets, ramshackle tents, and saloons that roared with desperation day and night. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and broken dreams. Finding one pathetic drunk in this sea of misery was not going to be easy. Ezekiel started where all stories in a place like this began and ended, the saloon. He chose the dirtiest, most desperate-looking one, the gilded cage, and pushed through the swinging doors. He showed the bartender a $10 gold piece. I'm looking for a man, Ezekiel said. Goes by Samuel Whitmore, a talker. Likes to cry in his beer about the wife and kid he left behind. The bartender, a man with a scarred face and dead eyes, looked at the gold piece and then at Ezekiel. A lot of men fit that description, he grunted. But yeah, I know him. Sammy the Ghost, we call him. 'Cause he's already dead, he just don't know it yet. He pointed with his chin toward a dark corner of the room. He's over there. Owed me a week's tab. Ezekiel turned. In the corner, slumped over a rickety table, was a gaunt, hollow-eyed man with thinning hair and the unmistakable shakes of a man in the last stages of alcoholism. He looked nothing like the dreamer Prudence had described. He looked like a rat who had been cornered by the world. This was Samuel Whitmore. Ezekiel walked over and sat down opposite him. Samuel looked up, his eyes struggling to focus. Who the hell are you? He slurred. I'm the man living in your house, Ezekiel said, his voice low and even. I got your letter. A flicker of cunning sparked in Samuel's ruined face. He tried to sit up straighter, to muster some semblance of dignity. Ah, Mr. Morrison, I was expecting you. Do you have my money? I have a question for you first, Ezekiel said, leaning forward. The fire. Was that your work? Did Croft pay you to burn down your own home? Samuel's eyes darted around the room. He licked his chapped lips. I don't know what you're talking about. That was lightning. Stop lying, Ezekiel growled. Your daughter saw Croft there, the smoking man. Tell me you didn't take money to terrorize your own family. Samuel flinched at the mention of Beatrice. A tiny, fleeting shadow of shame crossed his face. Croft is a persuasive man, he mumbled into his drink. He promised me a stake, a new start. He said he just wanted to scare Prudence off the land. I didn't know he'd burn the whole place down. The confession hung in the air, thick and foul. This man wasn't just a coward and an abuser. He was a monster who had conspired to leave his wife and child homeless for a handful of silver. She lost everything, Ezekiel said, his voice a low growl of fury. She was better off, Samuel spat, a sudden venom in his voice. She was never happy with me, always judging me with those righteous eyes of hers, and after the accident, she looked at me like I was garbage. I gave her a gift. I set her free. Ezekiel stared at the pathetic, twisted man in front of him. He had come here prepared to threaten, to bribe, maybe even to kill. But looking at Samuel Whitmore, all he felt was a profound, soul-crushing pity. The man was already in a prison of his own making. You're not getting a single cent, Ezekiel said, standing up. You will write a letter to Prudence, granting her a full divorce and relinquishing all claims to her and Beatrice. You will sign over the deed to the land, admitting you sold the water rights under fraudulent pretenses. You will do this, and then you will disappear. If I ever see you or hear from you again, the conversation we have next will be much shorter. He threw a piece of paper and a pen on the table. For a long moment, Samuel just stared at it. Then, with a defeated sigh, he picked up the pen. But just as he was about to write, the saloon doors swung open. Two men stood there, silhouetted against the harsh sunlight. One of them was the corpulent, crooked Sheriff Bodine. The other was one of Croft's hired guns. Well, 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 Bodine boomed, a greasy smile spreading across his face. Look what we have here. Ezekiel Morrison, having a nice chat with our dear departed Samuel Whitmore. Funny thing, Sammy boy here was just found dead in his room not 10 minutes ago, stabbed in the back. Ezekiel froze, his blood turning to ice. He looked down at the table, at the man sitting across from him. It wasn't Samuel Whitmore, it was just some other drunk who fit the description. Bodine chuckled, his eyes glinting with malicious triumph. We got a witness says you was asking around for him. Says you looked real angry. Looks like you found him, Morrison. And it looks like you're under arrest for murder. It was a frame-up, a perfect, inescapable trap. Croft hadn't sent the letter to extort him. He had sent it to lure him here, to this town, to this saloon, at this exact time. While his men murdered the real Samuel Whitmore and planted Ezekiel at the scene of the crime, he was miles from home with no allies, facing a corrupt sheriff and a murder charge in a town that ate men like him for breakfast. And back at the homestead, Prudence and Beatrice were now completely, utterly alone, with the monster who had orchestrated it all circling ever closer. The jail cell was a stone box that smelled of despair. Through the single barred window, Ezekiel could see the gallows being constructed in the center of town. They weren't wasting any time. In Croft's Valley, justice was swift, and it always served the highest bidder. He was trapped. Bodine had his gun, his money, and a dozen witnesses, ready to swear they saw him arguing with Samuel just before the body was found. He had walked into the snare like a fool. His quest to protect Prudence had led him to a hangman's noose and left her more vulnerable than ever. Days bled into one another. He paced the tiny cell, his mind racing, searching for an angle, a weakness, a way out. But there was none. He was a dead man walking. Then, one evening, a sliver of hope appeared in the form of a young boy, the stable hand who had cared for his horse. The boy slipped a folded piece of paper through the bars. "From the one-armed lady," the boy whispered, before scurrying away. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he unfolded it. The handwriting was Prudence's, strong and clear. "They think I am a broken woman. They think I am weak. They are wrong. I am not the woman my husband abandoned. I am the woman you taught to fight. The house is a fortress. The rifles are loaded. Beatrice is safe. Do not lose hope. I will not let them win." Tucked inside her note was another piece of paper, a drawing from Beatrice. It was a picture of the homestead. There was the house, the barn, and 3 figures standing in front, a tall man, a woman with one arm, and a little girl. Underneath, she had written, "Come home, Papa." A fire ignited in Ezekiel's chest, burning away the despair. They were fighting for him. They believed in him. He could not let them down. He had one card left to play, one long shot. Before leaving Kansas City, his old freight partner had given him the name of a man, a U.S. Marshal named Jedediah Kane, an incorruptible lawman who hated men like Croft and Bodine more than anything. The problem was, Kane was based in Cheyenne, 2 days away. Ezekiel had to get a message to him, and he had to stay alive long enough for it to matter. He used the last gold coin he had hidden in his boot to bribe the young stable boy. It was a desperate gamble. The boy could take the money and run, or Bodine could catch him, but it was his only chance. He scribbled a quick, urgent message to Marshal Kane, detailing the frame-up, Croft's land grab, everything. He prayed it would be enough. Meanwhile, back at the homestead, Prudence was preparing for war. She boarded up the downstairs windows, leaving only small slits to shoot through. She moved all their food and water into the main room. She slept in shifts, the heavy rifle always within arm's reach. Beatrice, no longer a quiet, frightened child, became her second in command. She reloaded the spare rifle, kept watch from the upstairs window, and reported every dust cloud on the horizon. The fire and the fear had forged her into a little soldier. They didn't have to wait long. One morning, just after dawn, they appeared. Silas Croft, Sheriff Bodine, and a dozen armed men. They rode into the yard and surrounded the house. "Prudence, my dear," Croft called out, his voice smooth as poison. "It's over. Your new man is going to hang for murdering your husband. It's a terrible tragedy. But don't you worry. I'm here to take care of you. Just sign the deed over to me, and you and the girl can walk away with your lives." Prudence appeared in the upstairs window, Samuel's old rifle resting steady in her one good hand. "This is my home, Silas," she called down, her voice ringing with a power he had never heard from her before. "You will not have it." Croft's charming facade dropped. "You foolish woman! You can't win! I have the law on my side!" "You have a liar and a coward on your side," Prudence retorted. "You're the one who paid my husband to set fire to this house. You're the one who had him killed when he became a liability." A shocked silence fell over the assembled men. Croft's face contorted in a mask of fury. How could she know that? And then the small voice of Beatrice piped up from the window beside her mother. "I saw you," the child said, her voice clear and unwavering. "The night of the fire. I saw you give my papa a bag of money, and Sheriff Bodine was with you. I saw him too. You're the smoking man, and you're a murderer." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, the keystone of the entire conspiracy. It wasn't just Croft, it was the law itself. Bodine wasn't just corrupt, he was an active partner in arson and murder. Beatrice's testimony, a child's pure and undeniable truth, was the one thing that could bring the whole house of cards crashing down. Bodine went pale. The other hired guns looked at each other, their loyalty suddenly wavering. They were paid to be thugs, not to be accomplices in a plot that would see them all hang. "She's lying!" Croft roared, pulling his pistol. "Kill them! Burn it to the ground!" But before he could fire, a new voice echoed across the valley, a voice of pure, cold authority. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Croft." Every head turned. On the ridge overlooking the homestead, silhouetted against the morning sun, were two men on horseback. One was the U.S. Marshal, Jedediah Kane, his star gleaming on his chest. The other was Ezekiel Morrison. He held a rifle in his hands, and his face was a mask of cold, righteous fury. The stable boy had come through. Justice had arrived. The battle for the Whitmore homestead was short and brutal. Caught between Ezekiel and the marshal on the ridge, and Prudence's deadly accurate fire from the house, Croft's men lost their nerve. Most threw down their guns and surrendered. Sheriff Bodine, seeing the game was up, tried to make a run for it. He spurred his horse, galloping wildly toward the woods. But Ezekiel had been waiting for this moment. He raised his rifle, took a steady breath, and fired. The shot was perfect, not to kill, but to cripple. Bodine screamed as the bullet tore through his leg, and he toppled from his horse into the dust. That left only Silas Croft. Enraged, trapped, and defeated, he did the unthinkable. He spurred his horse directly at the house, firing his pistol wildly at the window where Prudence and Beatrice stood. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me," he screamed, but he never made it. From the side of the barn, a figure emerged. It was Prudence. She had slipped out the back while everyone was focused on the ridge. She stood alone in the yard, holding the heavy rifle in her one arm, braced against her hip. Her face was calm, her eyes narrowed to slits. She was no longer a victim. She was an avenger. Croft was less than 20 yards away, bearing down on her. He raised his pistol for a final shot. Her rifle roared. The shot hit him square in the chest, lifting him clean out of the saddle. He landed in a heap in the very spot where Ezekiel had first found the cigar stub, the place where all their misery had begun. Silence descended on the valley, broken only by the whistling wind. Ezekiel ran down from the ridge, his heart pounding. He ran to Prudence, who was standing over Croft's body, the rifle smoke curling around her. He reached for her, and she fell into his embrace, the strength that had sustained her finally giving way to trembling relief. He held her tight, this incredible, unbreakable woman. He looked at the house they had built, at the daughter who stood on the porch watching them, her face streaked with tears of joy. They had faced down liars, cowards, and murderers. They had been burned out, framed, and betrayed. But they had held on. They had fought back, together. Marshal Kane walked up, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Morrison, I believe you have a visitor." He stepped aside, and Ezekiel saw him. The young stable boy from Eagle's Peak was holding the reins to Ezekiel's horse, and tied to the saddle was Ezekiel's chest, the one containing his fortune. The marshal had recovered it all. "You've got quite a family here, Morrison," Kane said with a wry smile. "And quite a homestead. I reckon no one will be bothering you again." Ezekiel looked at Prudence, her green eyes shining up at him. He looked at their home, standing strong and proud against the Wyoming sky. And he looked at Beatrice, who was now running toward them, her arms outstretched. He had come west, seeking a simple life. He had found a war instead. But in fighting that war, he had found something far more valuable than simplicity. He had found a love forged in fire, a family built on courage, and a home that was truly, finally theirs. The ashes of the old life had been washed away by blood and gunpowder, and from them, something new and beautiful and strong had finally been allowed to grow. 1 year later, Ezekiel stood on the porch of the finished house. It was bigger and grander than even he had planned, with a wide porch that wrapped all the way around. Prudence sat beside him in a rocking chair, her head resting on his shoulder. In her arms, she held their newborn son, whom they had named Samuel, not for the coward who had died in the dust, but for the future he represented. Beatrice, now a confident young woman of 11, sat on the steps, reading a book the new school teacher had lent her. The valley was at peace. Croft's lands had been broken up and sold to homesteaders. The corrupt Sheriff Bodine was serving a long sentence in a federal prison. The ghosts had been exorcised. "Papa," Beatrice said, looking up from her book, "tell me the story again." Ezekiel smiled. "Which one? The one about the shootout, or the one about the jailbreak?" "No," she said. "The first one, the real one." Ezekiel looked at Prudence, and their eyes met. He remembered that first day, the smell of smoke, the sight of this defiant, one-armed woman sitting in the ruins of her life. "Well," he began, his voice filled with a quiet reverence, "once upon a time, I traveled 1,000 miles to marry a stranger. I was looking for a fresh start. But when I arrived, I found her home had been burned to the ground. I thought it was the end of the story." Prudence squeezed his hand. "But it wasn't," she said softly, picking up the tale. "Because the man who arrived saw something more than just ashes. He saw a place to build. He saw a woman worth fighting for." "And I saw a man who wasn't afraid of a fight," Ezekiel added. "A man who saw my brokenness not as a weakness, but as a sign of strength. They looked out at their land, at the fat cattle grazing in the pasture, at the golden light of the setting sun painting the mountains. They had built more than a ranch. They had built a legacy. A story of two broken people who had refused to be beaten, who had faced down evil together, and who had found in the ashes a love that was stronger than any fire. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and frontier justice, and you want to hear more tales of people who fought back against the darkness, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You never know what secrets are buried, just waiting to be uncovered.